This is a tutorial on x and y intercepts. A x-intercept is where the graph of a function meets or crosses the x-axis. A y-intercept is where a graph of a function meets or crosses the y-axis. So let's look at the graph of y is equal to negative 3/4 x plus 3. It's already drawn for us. And if we wanted to find our x-intercept, we would go to the x-axis and we would go to where the function crosses it. So our x-intercept would be right here. And you'll notice the coordinate of our x-intercept is 4, 0. Because it intercepts x at 4, and then since it's on the x-axis, the y-coordinate is 0. Same thing for the y-intercept. We go to where the function crosses the y-axis, which is right there. And you'll notice the coordinate of our y-intercept is 0, 3. Because it intercepts the y-axis at the 3, and since it's on the y-axis, the x-coordinate is 0. So knowing that, you can look and see that every time we find an x-intercept, every x-intercept has a y-coordinate of 0. And every time we find a y-intercept, its x-coordinate is going to be equal to 0. So if we didn't have the graph and we just had the equation of y is equal to negative 3/4 x plus 3, and we wanted to find the x and y intercepts, we could plug in y is equal to 0 and x is equal to 0 and solve for the other coordinate. So let's try that. First, we're going to find the x-intercept. So when you're looking for the x-intercept, you know that y is equal to 0. So if we plug in 0 for y in our equation, we end up with 0 is equal to negative 3/4 x plus 3. Now we have to solve for x, so we'll subtract 3 from both sides. And we end up with negative 3 is equal to negative 3/4 x. And then we're going to multiply by negative 4/3 to both sides. And we find out that our x is equal to 4, which is what we found earlier. Now if we want to find our y-intercept, we know that x has to be equal to 0. So instead we'll plug 0 in for x. So here's our equation again. And we're going to plug in 0 for x. So we get y is equal to negative 3/4 times 0 plus 3. Now anything times 0 goes to 0. So our y is equal to 3, which is what we found earlier. So now that we know how to find x and y intercepts, let's try using them to graph some equations. Here we're given 3 linear equations, which means they're all equations of straight lines, and we'll use our intercepts to graph them. So let's start with the first one. Let's find our x-intercept first. Now our x-intercept is when y is equal to 0. So we plug in 0 for y, and we end up with 0 is equal to 5x minus 5. So add 5 to both sides. And we get 5 is equal to 5x. So x is equal to 1. So our x-intercept, or where our graph is going to meet the x-axis, well, it meets the x-axis at 1. So right here. Now we'll find our y-intercept. And remember, our y-intercept is where x is equal to 0. So we're going to plug in 0 for x. and we're going to end up with y is equal to 5 times 0 minus 5, and we're going to see that our y-intercept occurs where y is equal to negative 5. So we go to our y-axis, because remember x is 0, and we go to negative 5 on our y-axis, and we put another point. Now, to draw the linear equations, you just connect these two dots, and you have your linear equation graph. So let's try the next problem. Here we have y is equal to 1/2 x minus 3. So again, let's find our x-intercept, which is where y is equal to 0. So we end up with 1/2 x minus 3, which is equal to 0. We'll move the 3 over, and we're going to get 1/2 x is equal to 3, and then x is equal to 6. So our x-intercept occurs where x is equal to 6, which is right there. Now let's find our y-intercept, which is when x is equal to 0. So y is equal to 1/2 times 0 minus 3. This all goes to 0, and our y-intercept occurs when y is equal to negative 3. So we go to our y-axis and we go down to negative 3, and we put our point there. And then again, just have to connect the dots, and there's our graph of y is equal to 1/2 minus 3. Let's do this last example. Y is equal to negative 3/4 x plus 6. So once again, let's find our x-intercept, which is when y is equal to 0. So you're going to get negative 3/4 x plus 6 is equal to 0. Move the 6 over, so you get negative 3/4 x is equal to negative 6. So multiply both sides by negative 4/3. And we get x is equal to 8. So our x-intercept occurs where x is equal to 8. Now let's do our y-intercept, which happens when x is equal to 0. So we'll get negative 3/4 times 0 plus 6. This all goes to 0. So our y-intercept occurs when y is equal to 6. So we go to 6 on our y-axis. And then once again, we connect the dots. And that's the graph of y is equal to negative 3/4 x plus 6. So now that we know how to find and use x and y intercepts, let's see if we can apply them. Here we have a word problem that begins with Bob climbs down a 100-foot cliff at 5 feet per minute. How long will it take him to travel down the hill? If x represents how long Bob has been climbing, then the function f of x, which we're given, represents how high Bob is on the cliff at any given time. Graph the function using intercepts and explain what each intercept means. Well, let's look at our function, which is also the same as y is equal to 100 minus 5x. Now, if we were looking for our x-intercept, or when y is equal to 0, then we would find that x is equal to 20. Now, what does that mean when y is equal to 0? Well, let's think about the cliff, and let's pretend that this y-axis here is our cliff. Well, when y is equal to 0, Bob is at the bottom of the cliff. So the x-axis then would be like our ground. So Bob reaches the ground in 20 minutes. So we go to 20 on our x-axis and we put our point. Now let's think about our y-intercept. This is when x is equal to 0. So if we plug that in, we would find that y is equal to 100. Well, if this is our cliff, and our y-intercept is at 100, and we know the cliff is 100 feet tall, then our y-intercept in this case would simply just be the top of the cliff. So to connect the dots and see our linear equation, we can find out at what point Bob is on the cliff at any given time. So if we wanted to know how far Bob is down the cliff at, say, 10 minutes, we could plug 10 in for x, or we could use the graph and go up and then back over. And we could see that Bob is halfway down the cliff, or 50 feet high, after 10 minutes. And that completes the tutorial on x and y intercepts.